especially to still get some fresh air. But thank you all for joining us for part 2 of Urban Design for Humans. My name is Nicole Roberts, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator with the St. Petersburg Downtown Partnership. We've teamed up with different transportation partners from around the area, such as Pinellas Sun Coast Transit Authority, or PSTA, the Downtown Looper, Coast Bike Share, Cross Bay Ferry, and the St. Pete Pedicab to create Car-Free St. Pete, an initiative designed to encourage locals to explore the downtown area car-free. And we are excited to host Michael Houston today for his presentation on the private realm in urban design. A few things to get started. As you see, we will be doing a few polls throughout the
explanation. I'll go first. You can do that for me first.
You can see the results of our first icebreaker poll here. We had a pretty even split between wanting to bike, walk, and use Coast Bike Share to explore downtown St. Pete.
Nicole, I don't see the results there. Are they popping up?
Thank you.
Oh, there they go. Now they are.
Here we go. So we'll see these polls throughout the presentation. Additionally, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put it in the chat box at the bottom. And at the end, we'll be asking Michael the questions, so I can call on you to ask your question, or if for whatever reason you want me to ask the question, just let me know that in the chat box as well. But I will go ahead and stop sharing this poll and turn it over to Michael.
All right, thank you, Nicole, for the nice introduction. And let's see why my slide's not advancing. There we go. Just want to say thank you again to Car-Free St. Pete for having me and giving me this opportunity to share some ideas. Just to introduce myself, I am Michael Houston. I'm trained as an architect, but I've transitioned to urban design and planning over the years. I was a senior urban designer for the firm of DPZ Co-Design in Miami for 6 years. I currently have a storefront design studio on Central Avenue in the Grand Central District. And first and foremost, I'm just kind of a student of the built environment. And as such, I started a blog called The Empirical City, where I share some of my thoughts and ideas on urban form. And again, this is called Urban Design for Humans. I think these images kind of illustrate what we mean when we talk about urban design for humans. It's places for people to interact and come together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be involved with recreation. It can also involve places like workplace meetings. And it's not about this type of urban design, which is more oriented towards cars. So we want to kind of go from this to more like this. And the other part of my philosophy, planning philosophy, is that it should be focused around quality of life issues, enhancing quality of life. Too often we look at only one thing like transportation or economic development, and really you have to look at all of the different aspects of life in order to make good planning decisions. And so today in this presentation, just to give you a quick overview, we're going to do a really quick review of some of the things we talked about in part 1. Then we're going to kind of transition to what we call the private realm, and we'll explain what that is. We're going to do a crash course in beauty, which is something you don't often hear architects and designers talk about today, but it's something that I think is important. And we're going to talk about the tools to enhance the private realm. And I'm going to introduce you to this concept called the formostat, and it helps you kind of calibrate the right regulatory temperature for the community. That sounds more complicated than it is. And then we're going to talk about some important design elements for urban buildings. And our focus today is going to be primarily kind of in the downtown and urban areas. You could say the downtown kind of extends into Grand Central along Central Avenue, but primarily we're focused on the city center. So a real quick synopsis of part 2, or part 1, I'm sorry. In part 1, we talked about the natural transect. So the natural transect is a concept that was developed 200 years ago, and it's a way to divide up a natural ecosystem into different zones. And they pointed out how in each zone you have different animals and different plants that live there. And you move up in elevation, you might get another zone. And back in 2003, the folks at DPZ realized that you could say the same thing about urban environments, that you can take a city and you can divide it into zones. And these zones are kind of like urban ecosystems. So you have different street types and different buildings and even different people that live in these different zones. And it really helps you kind of organize the way you implement both the public realm and the private realm. And so we took that concept and we kind of mapped a general area of St. Pete. This is a very simplified map. But we looked at the 3 transect zones that are most prevalent. And it's starting with the T3 zone, which is kind of the suburban zone. And then we move into the T4 zone, which is kind of our historic neighborhoods, where we kind of find a balance in the transportation modes in that zone. And then you moved into your real downtown core, which we call the T5 urban zone. And the one point I wanted to kind of come back to this time in the T3 zone is to point out that this zone, even though it's the largest part of our city, many planners, including me, don't think it is sustainable either environmentally or economically over the long run. And there's an organization called Strong Towns that's written a lot about this, and they show that the revenue from the suburban zones, which are very low in density, the tax revenue really can't support the intensity of infrastructure that these areas require in the form of roads and sewers and utilities and all of those things. So that may be 50 years down the road when we reach that turning point where we can't sustain those areas, but I think eventually it's going to come. And then we also talked about the downtown, zooming into the downtown, and how right now the streets that move through downtown are kind of designed almost as if they want people to pass through downtown as quickly as possible. And that a better approach might be to think about actually treating downtown as the destination. So the roads lead there, but then once you get there, you slow down to a speed that's kind of comfortable and compatible with pedestrians. And I think this is one of the intents of the new mobility study that Forward Pinellas and the city are starting. And then we looked at some street transformations. So we took kind of a typical street design that we might find in downtown St. Pete. This could be like 8th Street as it moves through downtown. And we looked at ways to kind of transform that. And the most conventional might be to go to a complete street type design where you have designated bike lanes and lanes for scooters and e-bikes, but you also accommodate the automobile with parking and travel lanes. And then we started to move into kind of some more radical ideas of how you could incorporate things like markets in the center, or this one is called an Alameda. It's basically a landscape median that you can walk down. This one we call the Straza because you actually build buildings in the center and turn the street almost into like its own little plaza. And this one is the Green Street, so you basically turn it into a linear park. And then the new slides that I've added here show how those different street types can actually be combined, and you can have a few blocks of Alameda that lead to a Green Street, or you have some streets with parking in the center that terminate at a Straza. So they're kind of interchangeable. And so the idea is to take this, these are streets that exist in downtown St. Pete, and turn them into more like this. So, and you can imagine what doing this might do for the city of St. Petersburg. I mean, can you imagine the tourism and the economic development, and not to mention just the quality of life for the citizens, and that you wouldn't have to own a car to be able to live and enjoy a place like this. So in my mind, I know it's very aspirational to think that all of downtown could be like this, but maybe we can start in certain zones and grow over time. So now we're going to kind of transition into the private realm. Last time we started with this classic diagram from Leon Creer, but this time I'm going to use one that I developed since then. It's pretty much the same thing, but it's really important to keep in mind that the city is composed of 2 different realms. We have the public realm, which encompasses the public streets and the street trees and the civic buildings like the city hall and the libraries. And that's all part of the civic infrastructure. And then we have the buildings that occupy the private property, which are represented in the center there. So you put those 2 things together and you get kind of a complete view of the city. But it's important to keep in mind that you need to really deal with both in very different ways, because one is public property and one's private property. You have to deal with them separately. So we were moving from the public realm to the private realm. And then I'm going to, just to emphasize how important the private realm is, we have this image. This is a very well-known plaza in Paris, and I'm always a little reluctant to show slides from Europe because some people are a little touchy about that. But what I wanted to point out was how much the private realm impacts the public realm. So the buildings, which are privately owned buildings here, are really what gives this public space its character. And if you swap those buildings out with other buildings, it really changes the whole character of the city. So if we take that image and we put in a building from St. Pete, you know, suddenly, even though the building is similar in scale, it's got about the same amount of floors, completely changes the character, and you know instantly that you're not in Paris anymore, that maybe you're in St. Pete or another tropical city. So again, the private realm really is important to establishing the overall community character of the city. And just to dive in a little bit more on the public realm, again, this is a slide that I think is nice because it really highlights the public realm. So we have the streets and everything all in place, but the private realm is missing. There's no buildings. So we need the buildings in order to complete that. And luckily in this project, that was actually a photo of the streets in place. And this is an aerial when the streets are going in. It's a good example of showing how some public investment can lead to private development. So this is the construction site when the streets are going in, and this shows the same area with the streets in place. And now you have new apartment buildings. There's a new city hall in there. I know they're planning for a new hotel in one of these blocks. So it really shows that symbiotic relationship between the public and the private realm. And conversely, we have this image. This is from Omaha, Nebraska. And sometimes you have really beautiful buildings situated in the private realm, but then you look at the public realm, the street and sidewalk in this case, and it's not quite up to par with the building. So it's important to get both right. And I'm kind of perplexed that this sidewalk condition exists in, this is in Omaha, Nebraska again, because they have the highest per capita billionaires in the country, so I'm told. But evidently the infrastructure, the pedestrian and street infrastructure is not quite up to par, at least on this street. Hopefully, maybe it's changed since then. This is from a couple of years ago. And so when you get both of them right, you get really vibrant and lively and beautiful places. So again, why do we need a high quality private realm? It's for quality of life, for creating beauty, it's for economic development and tourism, workplace recruitment. It also adds to the sense of place and the sense of community, and just to stay competitive with our regional competitors like Tampa and Orlando. So now, because it's related to the private realm, I'm going to give you my version of a crash course in beauty, or you can call it natural aesthetics. And this is something that first came to my attention way back when I was in college. I read this essay by Nicholas Humphreys, and it's kind of stuck with me. It's like one of those times when the light bulb goes out, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So we've all heard the expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But in my opinion, beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder. I believe there are some objective attributes that things that we perceive as beautiful have, and trying to figure out what those are. And once we know what those are, we can incorporate them into our built environment. So first, I'm going to show you some images of I hope you'll agree that these images represent, beautiful environments or events or people. So we have a group of dancers there. We have a scale representing a musical score. I believe that's a hill town in Italy, could be France. And we have a nice tree and even a poem. I think I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. And what do all of those images have in common? And if we were all in a room together, I would stop and we would have a whole discussion about that. But since we're not, I'm just going to tell you the answer. or at least Nicholas Humphrey's answer, and that was rhyme. He used the word rhyme to describe what's going on in all of those images and what they all have in common. And you can take that concept and kind of describe it in different ways. You can call it sameness tempered with difference, or variations on a theme, or one that I like, a compound ratio of uniformity and variety. Or another one that I use sometimes personally is 80% order and 20% disorder. And I can't say that the exact ratios are correct, because I'm sure it varies a lot, but just that idea that you have to have some order and some disorder and something for it to be perceived as beautiful. And once we start thinking about that concept of rhyme and those definitions, and we go back and look at the images, you start to see how, you know, one figure is kind of rhyming with another, how one melody rhymes with another melody. And then we get to the built environment. So I thought this is a really good example of rhyming buildings. I believe this is Krakow, Poland. And I go back to that definition of a compound ratio of uniformity and variety. And we can use that definition and say, okay, what are the things that are uniform and what is adding the variety? And so I took those and kind of tried to break them down. So in terms of the uniformity, the building scale and proportion is kind of the same from one to the other. They're all kind of vertically proportioned. The windows you can see are all white, and they're more or less the same proportion, varying a little bit. And they all have these kind of pointy roofs at the top, but in different forms. And then the things that are adding variety are the wall color and the pattern, the way the ground floor is articulated, and the exact way that each of those little parapets at the top are articulated. So you can see in this image that we have a little bit of continuity and a little bit of variety. And there's different communities that kind of use this as a tool, maybe even without knowing it. These are some images from Santa Barbara, California. So they long ago established this kind of style guide where they said, okay, the buildings are going to be white and they're going to be kind of this Mediterranean influenced design. And even today when they do, you know, like an Apple store, it has to comply with these guidelines. So you end up with this, it's about at least a 1 mile long stretch of street with these beautiful storefronts, but you can see that each building is kind of rhyming with the other. There's some continuity, but then, you know, one has arches and one has posts and beams, and so there's also that element of variety. As opposed to this view, I took these photos when I was at the downtown Publix not long ago, and I looked around and I go, wow, none of these buildings are rhyming. You have the Publix, which is kind of this colorful postmodern thing on the left, and then you have this kind of tall mid-rise apartment buildings. I don't know what style that would be. On the lower left, you kind of have the Miami high-rise thing going, and then on the lower right, you get this kind of 1980s glass and steel kind of thing. And I think that lack of rhyme and that lack of continuity really kind of starts to degrade the urban environment. But we do have some rhyming buildings in downtown St. Petersburg. If you kind of focus on the more traditional buildings close to 4th and Central, a lot of those buildings tend to rhyme because they're all kind of masonry. They all have kind of these punched vertically proportioned windows. They all have a base, middle, and top. So there's some things that are constant from one to the other, even though each one is slightly different. And even some of the newer buildings in town, these are the cluster of buildings that just went up near Central and 16th. And you could say that these buildings are kind of rhyming with each other. And I don't know if that was intentional or it just happened that they were all built around the same time. So they're kind of responding to the same input in terms of stylistically and functionally what's going on in the climate right now. But anyway, I think these buildings kind of rhyme a little bit. So, and then I want to mention, so rhyme has what I call its evil twin. And the evil twin is not my cousin Wade, who's there in the photo. He's just representing the concept of novelty, which is kind of what I call beauty's evil twin. So it turns out that humans are not only attracted to beauty, but they're also attracted to novelty. So when you're young and you're holding an apple for the first time, you know, it's new and, you know, you can't believe the color and you're really intrigued by this thing. But as you grow older, you've kind of seen a lot of apples and a lot of other things over time. So it takes a lot more to intrigue you. So that's why we get buildings like what is shown on the left, I think. It's that kind of urge to see something new. But the downside of that, of course, is that novelty has an expiration date. Obviously, things can't remain novel for long. So a building like this might be really exciting for the first couple of years that it's around, and then pretty soon everybody's just walking past it without noticing. So, we have an interactive question now. So we were going to ask, and I think the way this is going to go, I'm going to read the question and then, oh no, you've got the question up there. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the concept of creating more beauty in our city of St. Petersburg? Is it not important at all? Not important, but I can live with a little. Number 3 is give me medium grade beauty, whatever that is. Number 4 is I want above average beauty. And number 5 is I want to live in a stunningly beautiful city. So think of your most beautiful image of what a city could be, whether it's Barcelona or Paris or Boston or wherever, and think of that. So I think we'll pause for about 30 seconds and let the results come in.
Yes. Yeah, it looks like there's a few more responses. And
I did respond even since we don't have that. Oh, wow, cool. Hopefully that's just not my response, that the other ones contributed to that, but that's great. So we have a lot of work to do. We have some areas of our city, obviously, that do have a lot of beauty, but if you kind of walk a few blocks away from those areas, you know, it's not very consistent. So we have more work to be done. Now, so putting novelty aside and focusing on enhancing the built environment, how do we do this? So as planners and urban designers, we kind of have 3 tools that we rely on to do this. So the first one that you're probably more familiar with is zoning. Second one we call form-based codes, and the third one is architectural design guidelines. And I'm going to go just into a little bit of detail about each of these. So zoning was a reaction basically to the Industrial Revolution and the fact that a lot of cities become overcrowded and very polluted, and you had things like tanneries right next door to residential areas. And there was kind of a reaction to this crowded urban environment, and they thought, oh, it'd be better if we just kind of separated everything. And unfortunately, it ended up going a little bit too far, but the intention was good. But they focused on separating uses, but not much on urban form or making good urban spaces. They focused on things like site development standards like setbacks and landscaping. And then eventually in the 1920s and 30s, we started getting parking requirements that started creeping in that really led to a lot of suburbanization. And there was, again, little attention to urban form. And a standard zoning code, as you guys may know, looks kind of like that. And then as kind of a reaction to that, so in the 80s and 90s, and really picked up speed in the early 2000s, we started using these things called form-based codes. And this, again, was a reaction to conventional coding. But the idea there was to focus more on urban form, on the shape of the building and its relationship to the street, and less on what the use inside the building is. So if we look at an example page from a form-based code that I'm working on right now, we're coding for something, in this case, we call it a detached residential building, but we're focusing on the form and how high it is and how far it is from the street. And we're giving a lot more flexibility to use. So you could even have multiple units within this building. Even though it looks like a single family house, it might be a duplex or a triplex. Or conversely, it might even have an office use in it, because we're really more concerned about how the building looks and the urban character than what goes on behind the walls. And if that's not enough, if that doesn't give you the quality of the urban environment that you want, then you can go to architectural design guidelines. And I think the reason why these are sometimes warranted these days are that in the past, say pre-World War II, buildings were really limited as to how they were designed. They were limited by the types of materials that were available. They were limited by the stylistic variations that were occurring at the time. Everyone was kind of trained in the Beaux-Arts movement, and so there was much more stylistic continuity. And now it's kind of, you know, anything goes when it comes to architecture. So sometimes you need some architectural design guidelines to kind of temper that down a little bit and make things a little more harmonious between the types, or between the buildings, I should say. And this is a page from some architectural design guidelines I've been working on as well from a different project. So you can see they get more into the materials, the roof types, the shapes of the windows. And this particular code, they were very clear that they didn't want to concentrate on very traditional forms of architecture, like is shown with the arch windows up there. They wanted to go a little bit more modern, but they still wanted some consistency. So that's what that code was attempting to do. So like any form of regulation, because we are talking about forms of regulation, it's a matter of degree. So we kept running into this thing where communities were a little hesitant about adopting some baseline standards for the buildings in the urban environment. So we came up with this analogy of a thermostat, and we called it a formostat. And so the formostat starts at a very low end with very basic urban design parameters, and then it moves up in the middle towards architecture. And then at the very high degree, you can go for like historic preservation and stylistic requirements. So we said that, you know, as a community, you kind of have to decide where you want to be. So then we took kind of a basic form-based code, or the elements of a form-based code, and we broke them down into these different elements or these different degrees. We started with the very basic ones, like where the building is located on the site, where the entry should be. So if you just do the first few steps, you still might end up with a building that looks kind of like the one on the lower right side, which may not be good enough. But if you keep going, you get into things like, you know, let's put some windows and a storefront maybe on the front of the building, and let's think about what the roof shape should be. So if you keep turning it up a notch, you start to get buildings that behave better with the sidewalk and the street, as like the one that's shown on the right, which is on First Avenue South. And then you can keep going if you want to and get into things like facade articulation, building materials and special requirements. Like, it could be, you know, green building requirements, or it could be historic preservation, you know, details in the buildings that you want to regulate. So if you really want to get specific, as is represented on the image on the right, you have to turn the code up to a high degree. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, again, a traditional look. It could be a modern look, but it really depends on how much control you want. So we have, hold on, someone. Thank you. Someone was knocking on my window. Typical Central Avenue. So if we kind of line those images up, you can see that we have the low degree over at the left, where kind of anything goes, no regulation, kind of do what you want, and all the way up to the right, where you're being very specific about what you want. And somewhere in that range, we say there's the community's comfort zone. So on the left, you kind of have more flexibility, more ability to kind of do what you want with your building. On the right, you have a more prescriptive code, but it also gives you adjacency predictability, which is important to developers sometimes, because they want to know that if they build this beautiful new building downtown, this beautiful new apartment building, that the guy across the street is not going to put up a self-storage building with no windows, or you know, a internet server building or something like that. So it's really good for both parties. It's good for the developer and it's good for the community. So now we're going to come to our next question, and we're going to kind of take this 9 or 10 degree code and simplify it into just 4 different levels. But we're going to ask you, you know, if you were tasked with writing design standards for the private realm in St. Pete. Would you go for a 0 degree, no regulation? Would you want a low degree code, which is probably kind of where we are now? We do have some design parameters. Would you want something in the middle, or would you want a really high degree code?
We'll wait for those answers to roll in here. Oh, and it looks like everyone preferred the medium degree.
Oh, okay. I guess I was in that pact as well. Great. All right, and let's see, moving along. So we're kind of to our last section, or we have 1.5 more sections to go, so it won't be too much longer. But so I wanted to just talk about a few important design elements that urban buildings need to have in order to add to the built environment instead of detract from it. And the first one, kind of the most fundamental one, is called eyes on the street. And this was first coined by Jane Jacobs, who was a journalist in New York City. And I believe this book came out in 1961. It's called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And if you're new to urban planning and the way cities work, it's a great book to start with. But in that book, she coined this term eyes on the street. And essentially what she was saying is that when you design buildings, they need to be up close to the street, and they need to have doors and windows and people coming and going and looking out of the windows, so that you kind of, in a way, kind of self-police the public realm, so that you have people constantly looking and seeing what's going on, and you become part of the kind of the neighborhood community security. And while I was going down First Ave North, I noticed in this block, you have the new Icon building, which does have eyes on the street. Even some of those eyes at the very top are in the parking garage, so they don't add much to the environment. But at least you've got doors, windows, and balconies and things that are overlooking the street. Whereas on the other side, I think this is internet business or a cable business. And there's no windows or doors. So there's no one that's actually monitoring what's going on the sidewalk and making sure kind of everything's okay. So it's better to have a condition on the left than on the right. And if you don't have a requirement that tells builders and designers that you need to have windows on your buildings, which seems kind of common sense, but actually sometimes, as you can see, people build buildings with no windows in their downtowns. And the other one is one that I wrote an article about called this building type, the McMain Street. So on the left, you kind of see the traditional Main Street, which that happens to be from the town where I grew up in Kentucky. Have a very nice Main Street. But back in the 90s, again in the 90s, we were just kind of figuring out how to design and code for cities again. And we started seeing these big buildings popping up, and we thought, well, it'd be really nice if we could kind of break those buildings down into smaller buildings and make them look more like our traditional main streets. So some design standards started requiring buildings to be kind of sliced up into smaller buildings. But the problem was that with that is that, number one, they've sliced them up too much, as you can see from the image on the right. And number two is that a lot of architects are just not very good at trying to replicate traditional building forms. So you get kind of a dumbed down version of what the kind of elegant Main Street is on the left, and you get this kind of cartoon version of Main Street on the right. So we coined this term McMain Street to kind of describe that kind of ubiquitous look of these chopped up buildings. And this one happened to be from in Seattle. So this is a hotel. And my argument was, why not let a hotel look like a hotel? You don't need to make it look like a bunch of little cartoon versions of a Main Street. And then this one's probably the most horrible one of all. I think this one was in Utah. I can't remember where it was, because it really, when you look at it, could be anywhere in the United States. But not only did they, try to break the building up and disguise it as this kind of overblown McMansion. So not only is the private realm really bad taste, but also obviously the public realm, the streets and the sidewalks are in pretty bad condition. So we want to get away from doing this kind of thing. And this is just kind of a three-dimensional diagram of what a McMain Street looks like, and how if you kind of simplify it and focus on some of the ups and downs and a little bit more random rhythm, you can make the building fit in a little bit better. So another important element, especially more important these days, I think, is providing some semi-private open space for urban dwellers. This really came to my mind after COVID. The importance of this came to my mind after COVID. Before, I would not have written a building or a design code standard that would have required balconies, but today I'm kind of rethinking that, because it really is critical, I think, if we have another pandemic, hopefully we won't, that you give people a place to come stand outside, and even if they're in a mid-rise or a high-rise, and get some fresh air. And if they're on the ground level, that there should be some little space where they can take a chair outside and sit down outside without having to compromise their health. The other concept, again, this came from the 90s, and we were figuring things out. It's don't overestimate retail on the ground floor. So we used to have this vision of downtowns as once you get to a certain density, you're just going to have ground floor commercial and stores everywhere on every block. And in a lot of codes, we actually required the ground floors to be commercial use or to be built to commercial standards. But we're kind of pulling back from that now. And one of the reasons is that the retail and commercial market is shrinking because of internet business, obviously. But also we realize that even really dense cities like New York and Paris have a lot of buildings that don't have ground floor commercial. So you can go to the densest part of New York and you're still going to see buildings that don't have commercial, and the same, in the heart of Paris. So now we're being more strategic about where we require that. But sometimes we do need to require it. And I think this is a little bit unfortunate that this new building on Central Avenue, that there's one stretch of it that doesn't have commercial, at least it doesn't look like commercial. And I don't know about you, but I would probably not want to live in a dwelling unit that's right up on Central Avenue and have people walking by at midnight on a Saturday, just been partying. I think Central Avenue should be at least built to commercial standards, even if it's not a commercial use. Another important thing is to screen parking garages. I think the building on the left does a pretty good job of that. And that was in reaction to having buildings like the one shown on the right. And then maybe the most critical element is the way you add windows and doors, or we can call it fenestration, to buildings. Because when you really think about it, most buildings, you can kind of simplify down to a wall with windows and doors and a roof. So if you don't get those two elements right, then your private realm is gonna suffer. So these are some images of kind of the wrong way to do it. I think it's funny that the one on the left, I think, is a Florida Health Department building, where it kind of looks like a Darth Vader type, very unfriendly building. We also find that buildings that are all glass are kind of inhuman because they don't have that layer of scale to them. They kind of look like somebody that comes at you with big sunglasses on. And then for whatever reason, banded windows, those horizontal bands, are very monotonous and don't seem to be very humanly scaled. So we want to stay away from those prototypes and do more like this. And it can be either a modern building or traditional, to kind of balance the ratio of solid to void, of wall to window. And when you do that, the building starts to start to harmonize, even though they might be of different styles. And I think we're almost done. Oh yeah, we wanted to mention an issue with affordable housing. So, let's say that a lot of these ideas are implemented someday. I would have a concern that if we make downtown so great that it's quickly going to become unaffordable. Actually, it already is in a lot of ways unaffordable for many of us. But at the same time, I see a lot of public buildings with a lot of underutilized parking lots in the downtown. I also see churches with underutilized parking lots. And I think a good strategy to have would be to kind of land bank those and say, hey, don't sell off that property or give it over to private developers, or at least retain some of it and maybe sell off some of it. but to utilize that to promote the idea of affordable housing. It could be subsidized, or it could be as part of a negotiation with the developer. But that we want to keep a supply of affordable housing in the downtown. As things get better and prices go up, there should still be places for people to live and work. And so finally, almost done, just summing it all up. And this is a summary of the both presentations. So number one is, oh, let me move this window out of the way so I can see. Okay, so number one is there really needs to be a paradigm shift between the way we design streets, especially in the city center. So we need to go from these car-dominated environments like the one shown here. And actually, this one was actually not that bad even to begin with, but the cars just kind of overwhelm it. But if you look at what can be done with the street and how it can be given over to human activity, more space anyway to human activity. And there's still some parking there. You still allow cars to come by. You still allow vehicular access, but now you have like a little garden, you've got bike storage, and you have people actually occupying that space that at one time was only used for cars. Oh, and this quote, whoops, let me go back there. I love this quote, and I'm not going to say who said it, you can Google it, because the person that said it is running for a high elected office right now. But he said, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. So in thinking about how we're going to implement these things and what kind of city we want to be, we really have to put our money where our mouth is and start funding some of these street transformations and some of these improvements to our built environment. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to happen. Just as a side note, I'm trying to get some painted bike lanes on a street in my neighborhood here in St. Pete. And, you know, you would think I was asking for the street to be paved in gold because the money is just not there. And I know the city staff is also frustrated, but, you know, it's just all we have to work with. So we need to actually fund some of these ideas. And then number two, we talked about the transect and how we can divide the city into different transects and different urban ecosystems, and how we can use this to inform decisions about streets and buildings. Number three, we looked at the downtown and how we want to go from a downtown where you just pass through at high speeds on these very wide lanes to a downtown where we slow the traffic down and make it more human scaled. And finally, about how we should give some attention to the private realm and how the private buildings really help form a lot of the character of the community and reflect the community's vision. And then the last thing is just remembering the two different realms and how important they are to making a complete city. And with that, I think our final exercise is to do one more poll. And in this one, we were going to ask you to kind of pick which one of these four concepts I just mentioned, and even if you didn't see the first presentation, do you think is the most important to transforming our city in a positive way? And I didn't put as you can see, none of the above, so that was intentional. And we'll wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah. I know I personally really love just learning about the street transformations, seeing all those options, and seeing that combination of how you can combine them together to create a connected flow.
Yeah, and all of these things obviously are interrelated, but so just because you pick one doesn't mean the other ones won't.
Well, it looks
unfortunately, we don't have that authority, right?
Looks like everyone has answered, and downtown seems to be the most popular.
Okay, great. But we got, did we get a vote for the last thing as well, or was it the first three? I guess it was the first three.
First three.
Yeah, okay. Great. Okay, I think that was my last slide, and I was going to turn it over to, back over to Nicole for kind of the wrap up.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Michael, for this presentation. It's been amazing. I've already gotten a few comments just about how good this presentation has been, so thank you very much. Again, thank you all for joining us so far. We're going to go through some questions. So if you have a few, feel free to put them in the chat box below. But I just want to let you guys know that if you support this vision of better urban design for humans, not for cars, and a more beautiful city in our private realm, definitely follow Civic Plan Studio on Facebook and Twitter, I believe. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to Michael at his email on the screen here, or you can check out his blog, theempiricalcity.com. And of course, if you support car-free initiatives, you can come and follow Car Free St. Pete on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check out our website, carfreestpete.com. But we have a few questions. So the first question for you, Michael, is how can a city overcome its lack of rhyme from many decades of hodgepodge development?
Well, you can use those 3 tools that we talked about. Obviously, we already have zoning in place, and there are some design standards in the zoning ordinance. And in fact, they just updated those recently in the last year. But it's really, again, a matter of degree. If we're not getting enough rhyme, then we can, take another look at those design standards. And I think a really easy one, or 2 really easy ones, are materials and color palette, because you can, if you kind of narrow the selection of those 2 things, you can still allow a variety of styles. You can still have traditional buildings and you can still have modern buildings. But at least they're within a range of color palette. Another important one would be roof types. And it might also be that you have different standards for different areas. So in your areas in the downtown core that are more the older areas, you might tend towards a more traditional set of design standards, whereas you come up, central to the 16th Street area, you might have more modern standards. So there are definitely ways that you can get that rhyme using design standards.
I think that definitely makes sense, especially going down Central Avenue. You can definitely, I feel like, you need a different feel for the Edge District.
Exactly.
So yeah.
And that can also actually be extended to the street. So maybe in the older areas where you have a more traditional private realm, you also do things with the lamp fixtures, with the light fixtures and the street paving. And so actually, as you move from one zone downtown to another, you kind of get a different character. It doesn't all have to be the same.
I think that's a good idea. Would you be able to discuss a little bit about the orientation of entrances and coordinating them with desired pedestrian crossing locations, and just creating that kind of interaction between private property right away?
Yes, so it's one of the most fundamental things that we put in the form-based code, or the orientation of the entries. And this is kind of easier when you're in a downtown area. There's kind of no confusion of where it should be. It should be on the sidewalk. And because a lot of the downtown is divided into small storefronts, you get, doors every 20 or 30 feet, which is really good because it helps to enliven the sidewalk. It's when you get into those larger buildings that maybe only have 1 or 2 entries, and then the locations become critical with the crosswalks and bus stops and things like that. Where it gets even trickier is when we try to do this kind of pedestrian-oriented urban design out in the T3 suburban areas, which, in the first presentation, I talked about the mismatch and how sometimes the goals are mismatched. But sometimes we're asked to write standards to orient buildings to the street, even though everyone's arriving by car and in the parking lot in the back of the building and wants to enter in the back. So that's where it gets really tricky, because then you have to decide, do you put doors in both locations, or recently we've been showing a lot of breezeways in between buildings. So it's a way to kind of connect the front of the building with the back of the building. But downtown, it's a little bit easier because it's almost always on the street and people recognize that.
Awesome. Kat shared, so she wanted to let you know that this is very educational. And she shared that they currently live in Channelside, which is going through a redesign for more pedestrian vibrancy. Is that something, do you know if St. Pete is working towards something similar or even better?
I don't. I know the mobility study is about to start, which is intended, I think, to tame the main arterials that kind of come through, like 8th Street and 4th Street and 16th. But I don't know where they are with pedestrian-oriented design. I know a lot of people at the city share that vision and goal of making downtown more walkable. And it's probably going to happen in stages, and with things like this, and people like you all and me, hopefully we can push those things along.
Yes. And I know with the downtown mobility study, right now they're in the second phase doing listening sessions, but I read that they will be doing another online survey, I think within the next few months. So definitely keep your eye open. I know that's something we'll post about at Car Free St. Pete. But definitely, I think this audience would be engaged in that and interested in participating.
Great.
I think we only have one more question. If anybody in the audience does have another question they'd like to ask, just throw it in the chat box now. But for a maybe final question, you showed that example of public investment in that other community and how that spurred on more private investment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea of maybe, something we could do in St. Pete that could be similar and spur more quality private development?
I think in terms of the downtown, there's a lot of areas that seem to me to be underdeveloped and have a lot of potential. And I think those would probably develop even if you didn't do a big investment. Although if you do improve the streets, and it'll certainly speed up the investment in the private realm. That project happened to be in the small town of Roanoke, Texas, and they had this barely existent main street. And that really, actually, this project shows the power of doing a form-based code. But I worked on a form-based code with the lead firm, which was Gateway Planning. And we developed a code and a street system for that area and put it in place so that when the market arrived, that everything was in place to ensure that the buildings were built the right way and had the right orientation to the street and the city invested in the infrastructure. And then 10 years later, it's just become a boom, and there's new hotels and new housing. And so it really shows the power of combining investment in the public realm with the right regulatory structure.
No, that's awesome. Christine actually just put in the chat as well. Have you, I don't know if you're familiar with the Innovation District, but it has a very suburban feel. Do you have any recommendations for how that area could kind of become more urban?
I haven't seen the plan. I don't know if there's a master plan for it. I'm familiar with kind of where it is, but not that up to speed on it. But, certainly using the tools that we discussed, I think having a master plan, if there isn't one, maybe, likely there already is one, but really establishing a vision ahead of time and then putting the regulation and the public investment in place to implement that vision is how it all starts. You kind of have to have a roadmap and a clear vision in order to be able to get there eventually. If you just kind of do it piecemeal without really having that master plan, then it's, probably not going to happen, or it's going to take a longer time to happen.
Well, that makes complete sense.
Innovation District, I'll look at it closer.
Awesome. Oh, we just had one more come in the chat. So Kat asked, is there a plan for providing affordable artists/makers studio in the area?
Not that I know of. I have friends that are artists that are always looking for cheap studio space or even affordable studio space. I know there's some initiatives happening in the warehouse district, and but no, I don't know of any personally. And just as a reminder, I don't have any official capacity in the city or an organization. I'm just somebody that does this type of work and is, loves cities and kind of putting these ideas out there. So hopefully folks like us can make those things happen.
I do know that they are opening the Factory St. Pete, which I think is,
right.
Provides some affordable, studio spaces for different kinds of artists. And it looks like they're going to be opening in fall of 2020. So
Right.
definitely keep your eyes open for that. I know I follow them on Instagram, and I think that's a good way to keep up to date with what their updates as they're building. Awesome. Well, it looks like there's no more questions, and we're coming to the end of our time anyways. So thank you, Michael, again for this amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today as well for our discussion. And I hope to see you again at another Car Free St. Pete event.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye-bye.